Thanks, everybody, and welcome to day two. And it's the final day of the Zero Trust Summit. My name is John Yeoh, and I'm here to introduce the agenda for CSA. Yesterday was a great first day, and I wanted to recap because we did hear from a lot of true leaders in the Zero Trust space. People like Chase Cunningham, John Kinderbog, Sean Cordero talked, Daniela Catatu, and Sean Connolly. Uh, Sean Conley's over from the CISA part had a good things to say. George Finney, Jason Garbus, Chris Steffen, and there's so many more that I'm missing. But I promise today is going to continue with some really good things, and so I'm excited at least to introduce today's lineup to you. And let's get into it just a little bit. I'll tell you what I know about the speakers and the presentations. I'm not going to give too much away because I want you to be able to enjoy what they're saying for the rest of the day. But let's start off too. So once you're done, hearing from me, you're gonna go right to Randy Rednick and Amy Hamilton. And so Randy Resnick and Amy Hamilton, they are coming from the government side, and you're going to hear a lot about critical infrastructure for Zero Trust today, or Zero Trust for the security of critical infrastructure. And they're going to kick us off and get into some of the implications that we're seeing with all these critical systems, government, and even just foundationally how we're doing that with our own national defense systems. Second thing we're going to see is from JJ Manella and Josh Woodruff. So again, we're sticking with a theme here today: Zero Trust guidance for critical infrastructure. There is a publication that CSA put on the topic, and I'll talk about that a little bit too later on. But hearing from JJ and Josh is going to be really important because they were critical at authoring the document and identifying, what is considered critical infrastructure, not just globally, but how are we defining it these days within the United States. After that, we have Jay Tilson and John Spiegel talking about transformer security. This is the power of SSE and its security at the service edge for zero trust access. And think about this is the security aspect of SASE and even CASB. So how do we implement controls? How do we protect those levels? Jay and John are going to be talking about that. Let's keep going because it's not over. Again, sticking with that critical infrastructure theme, Josh Woodruff is going to talk with Bryson Bort about the same topic. And as we look at implementing zero trust, there's going to be 5 critical steps, and protecting critical assets, identifying what that protect surface is. Josh and Bryson are going to get into that. As we talked yesterday about some new technologies and how approaching security with new technologies, how zero trust aids in that. Tima Soni, who's with the UN, is actually going to talk about the quantum era. So I think yesterday we talked about zero trust and how that applies to artificial intelligence and generative AI systems. We're going to take this to the quantum level too. So for those who are paying attention to what quantum is going to do for existing encryption methods, how we're utilizing quantum computers for all sorts of different things beyond just security. We're going to talk about how we can use zero trust to actually protect those systems. What do we need to do for that? What are some of the latest techniques and tactics that we're going to want to do with quantum? So team is going to talk about that. Great person to speak to. Chris Niggle will be next, talking about zero trust, identity, and emerging threats. I've known Chris for over 10 years. He's been an identity expert, advisor, consultant in a lot of ways, helping people implement some of the latest identity practices. And zero trust it's a big pillar for zero trust, making sure that we're protecting assets and access to those things. Okay, moving on, we have still a very full day. So Paul Simmons, who is one of the pioneers also when it comes to zero trust and just the 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 new perimeter, uh, the new identity perimeter topic. Paulson is going to address that issue too in zero trust. So I've known Paul going back to the Jericho days, back before zero trust was even a concept, but the concept still existed on that approach. So Paul is going to probably talk about the history of that and how zero trust is so important, at least the concept today, and what it means. And additionally, as we go into lunchtime, at least here on the West Coast, you can have a Q&A with the father of Zero Trust, John Kindervag, and Chris Steffen, who is one of the chairs for the Zero Trust Working Group at CSA, certainly a leader in the space, someone who's very vocal and a good person to talk to. So take advantage of that live Q&A, join the discussion, ask questions live about your questions around Zero Trust. How do we define it? What are the implementation practices? What are the best techniques? How do we measure up to the maturity model? So many different things that I can't wait to ask John and Chris. So I hope you join that conversation as well. We're going to close the day out with Daniel Schrader is going to talk about zero trust in your cloud architecture. Devin Ertel is going to talk about fortifying zero trust, reducing that attack surface, and mitigating all those threats, including insider threats. And to close out the day after that, to Eric Johnson, who is the lead analyst for Zero Trust at CSA. He's going to recap everything for you and hopefully provide some of his insights as well on what he saw on the day. So that's the day ahead of you. And I know I certainly shared a lot of what's upcoming. Hopefully I didn't give away too much. But one thing I did want to share is, we talked about critical infrastructure, which seems to be the theme for the day. And CSA did a collaboration effort with a lot of organizations on this. So the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security with CISA, the NSA, universities like MIT and others were all in on contributing to how do we have zero trust guidance for critical infrastructure. And it's broken down in several different layers too, but we will implement how the 5 steps for zero trust. What is that process like for the OT and the ICS environment, from defining that protect surface? How do we map those transaction flows across OT and IT environments? How do we properly build that zero trust architecture? Down to creating and defining security policies across all those different architecture layers. And then, of course, importantly, with the zero trust strategy is how do we properly monitor and maintain that process and the management of all those key elements and components. So in addition to that, this document is going to go nicely into defining all the critical infrastructure sectors that we have worldwide. And it's not just the main ones that we've talked about globally, but also the ones that CISA from our Department of Homeland Security has introduced. So looking at different things from information technologies to what are the economic incentives, political incentives that we need to protect against. What is cyber warfare and cyber espionage looking like? So from a critical infrastructure perspective, how do all these systems tie together? And we're going to look at these different threat vectors. We're going to look at those convergences across OT and IT systems. So what are the digital touch points that we need to pay attention to, those boundaries that we need to understand so that we can implement proper practices? And we try to avoid the word trust in our zero trust conversations nowadays, because the idea is zero trust. So how do we create confidence and validate these boundaries as we're looking at understanding digital touch points across critical infrastructure systems? And that is the main point of this document too. So what are these differences between OT and IT systems? What are these digital touch points? What is the difference between digital and physical? How can we protect against that? That's going to be a big part of this document. So yeah, I encourage you to download it. Again, it's free to download, cloudsecurityalliance.org/ZT. That's where you're going to find just a plethora of information for Zero Trust. We have our online hub. We have access to the working groups where you can either download, read, and consume all the content that we have. You can take training for your staff and your team. You can even join the effort, join the working groups, and actually be a part of what we're doing here. So I really encourage everybody to do that. I think it's a lot of fun. And I've said this many times, the guidance documents are incredible. It is a snapshot of what takes place within the working groups. We try to just condense and put together the best practices of what's talked about in these working group meetings. But if you're part of the meetings, there's so much more that you get from a networking perspective, from just a knowledge gaining perspective. And so I encourage you to check that out real quick too. I'm going to just close on this too. So please check out the agenda. It's going to be full of critical infrastructure today. I shared that best practices for protecting against critical infrastructure, and these are just some terms I think that uh, I want everybody to consider as we go through these learning sessions. Protect surface might be a different terminology than we're used to. We're used to talking about attack surface, and protect surface just narrows down what we're focusing on. So instead of protecting the entire landscape of something, looking at the entire attack surface, what are the critical assets that we want to protect? That's our protect surface. We also have the word trust boundaries here, and trust boundaries again, trying to get out of that word trust. But what are the layers? What does the data flow look like if we're mapping what we're trying to protect within our either cloud architecture, security architecture, or zero trust architecture? So we're looking at transaction flows, and these are those trust boundaries that we want to identify so that we can protect those layers against and not just trust something, but make sure that we're verifying or validating something's there. I think this last term is super important to understand too. It's confidence with validation. So in exchange of the word trust, I think confidence with validation makes a lot more sense. This has been a consensus that the working group has identified as knowledge that makes sense across the board. It also fits in with the 5-step process for zero trust implementation that we talked about. So we're defining a protect service. We're mapping these transaction flows into a zero trust architecture, and then we're creating policies to define to creating policy to demonstrate that confidence and to demonstrate at least validate what we're doing so that we have more confidence in these boundaries that we have. So with that, let's kick you off to the rest of the day, which I think is which is super important. Let's get into details. Let's hear from the rest of the agenda on how we're able to implement zero trust practices, how we're able to protect our critical infrastructure with zero trust practices. And like I said, as you go through here, keep these three terminologies, these three terms at the front of your mind: protect surface, trust boundaries, and confidence with validation, because we're going to be using that a lot. And this is how it's applied to zero trust practices. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thanks for attending.